Hi everyone, it's Angela from Cloudfetti, and today I'm sharing tips, tricks and techniques on how to glaze polymer clay with UV resin. So to start out, UV resin is a thick, clear liquid that cures or hardens under ultraviolet light and creates a glossy layer or coating which you can use to add shine to and protect your polymer clay projects with. It's not the same as two-part epoxy resin, where you need to mix equal parts of bottle A, which is the resin, and bottle B, which is the catalyst that starts the curing process, and needs 12 to 36 hours to harden once the two parts are combined. UV resin is totally different. It's quick curing and can be used right out of the bottle. It doesn't need mixing and requires ultraviolet light to undergo a chemical reaction to harden. There are so many brands of UV resin out there. They can be either thick or thin options. There are also UV curing top coats for nails that already have a brush in it. I've tried a fair few brands of UV resin and I found that some are lesser quality than others. My favourite to use is this one, which is by Handcrafter, and it's their hard type UV LED resin. It cures super hard, is high quality, and gives a really nice even glossiness compared to other brands that I've tried. It's also non-yellowing and has been since I've coated my pieces with it in 2021. I've also found that in the liquid stage, it doesn't have a weird smelling odour like some other brands do. And although it costs a little bit more, it's worth the price because of the extremely shiny finish that it creates. Some brands I unfortunately wouldn't recommend, like this one by Chow Chow DIY. Although it's cheaper and really popular, I found that I don't like it at all. It has like this really strong chemical smell, and it takes a long time to cure. Sometimes it didn't even cure at all, no matter how long I had it in the sun for, and I've tried it on really hot days. And it did discolour a lot of my pieces with a yellow tinge over a very short amount of time. So since there are so many brands on the market, I would recommend doing your own research and looking up some reviews of different brands to try before you actually buy them. I would check out the price, the cure time, or if it cures at all, if it has an odour, and how quickly it turns yellow. Then I would give some a try and see what you prefer as well, because every UV resin brand is different. You might like some different aspects of particular brands depending on the different type of creation that you want to coat. I don't always add a UV resin finish to my clay because once it's baked, it becomes PVC plastic and it's waterproof, so it doesn't really need any protective coating. Only if you'd like an ultra shiny finish, if it's going to be handled a lot to add extra protection to it, or there's been a surface treatment added to it like mica powder. When I do add UV resin, I always add it to fully baked polymer clay, and then once it's been applied and cured, I never bake my pieces because it can emit strong fumes and be toxic, so make sure that it's the very last step of your project. I like to add it to give pieces a lot of glossy shine and on top of charms that I sell in my online store to give a bit more protection during the shipping process. Otherwise, I like to leave them unglazed and plain with a matte finish. UV resin can cause people to have severe allergic reactions. If you have an allergy or have developed an allergic reaction to any kind of resin, please stop using it immediately. Once an allergy develops, a reaction will almost always happen the next time that you use it, so don't risk it and just use an alternative product. If you're allergic or wanting a different effect on your clay piece, I would say to leave it uncoated as polymer clay is waterproof once baked, or you could use a different varnish such as water-based polyurethane, which not only comes in gloss, but also satin or matte for different finishes. You could also sand and buff your piece to create high shine, or you could also use glazes made by polymer clay manufacturers like Sculpey or Fimo. You really don't want to use things like Mod Podge, clear nail polish, or spray varnishes, as these aren't compatible with polymer clay and will cause them to turn sticky over time. The tools that I use are UV resin, a paintbrush, a silicone cupcake liner to squeeze my UV resin into, and either a UV LED lamp or direct sunlight. I also use proper PPE or protective gear. Since UV resin is a chemical, you really do need to be protected. It's really important when working with any kind of resin and not just the UV type to use a respirator with VOC P95 filters. If you're in Australia, you want to make sure that the mask says AS or NZ 1715 or 1716, as these comply with Australian safety standards. Then also use unventilated goggles to protect your eyes. I also prevent skin exposure, not just on my hands by using nitrile gloves, but also with some sleeve covers. I also have long hair, so I tie it up so that it's not all over my face or accidentally going into my resin. And although I'm very careful when using UV resin, I also choose to wear clothes that I can ruin and an apron if it spills on me. I also use a piece of baking paper to protect my work surface, a fully baked polymer clay creation with or without an eye pin. If you're not sure how to properly bake your clay, I do have a separate tutorial sharing how, which I'll leave a link to in the description box below. I also use gel superglue to secure the eye pin in, and for charms in my online store, I also secure the pin with UV resin for extra strength with a fine tip applicator bottle so that I can be super precise. I then also use a paper clip to hold my charms while brushing on the UV resin, and chopsticks and sticky tape to hang my charms from, and a thick piece of cardboard that I covered with kitchen foil, and this helps with the curing process, which I'll go into more detail about later. To cure the UV resin, you could use a nail lamp with ultraviolet bulbs. The minimum wattage that I found that works well is 36. This more traditional UV type lamp has 4 bulbs that need to be replaced when they blow out, and these usually have an infinite timer button, so you can just press it and go about doing something else in the meantime. You can also use a large UV LED type of lamp, which I like to use. It's great for curing both plain UV and UV LED type resins, and I found that it cures much faster than the traditional type of lamp. It's also more cost effective since you don't have to buy replacement bulbs. This one doesn't have the infinite timer button, so you just have to keep checking it and pressing the button after a couple of minutes, but I find that's only a small issue. These ones also come in different sizes and wattages. If you go under or above the standard 36 watts, they'll still work, but take longer or shorter to cure. I also use a smaller 6-watt UV LED lamp, which is powered by USB, and this one is great for curing small things in a pinch. To hang the charms and chopstick on, I like to place them on different surfaces like mini pot plants or the lid of a canister if I only have one or a few charms. If I have a lot more, I'll use a wire rack instead. Whatever tools you're using, just make sure that these are dedicated to UV resin only and they're not used for any other crafts or in parts of your house, like in your kitchen for example. I like to do this to avoid cross-contamination and have it all in one space. Working with UV resin is a little bit messy, so you want to work on a flat, even surface in a dedicated area away from children and pets. You also want to make sure that it's well ventilated with lots of airflow and that you have easy access to cleaning supplies. I like to work on a sheet of glass so that it's easy to clean up. I then also use a sheet of baking paper that I can dispose of to cover my work surface. I also keep the window open to keep the area well ventilated. And I use some isopropyl alcohol wipes just in case and a lined rubbish bin nearby to clean up. You don't want to pour or glaze with UV resin while outside, as it will cure while you're still working with it. I found that strong ambient light can cure UV resin as well, like from my big umbrella lights that I use to film. So I try not to have it near these if I can. Since UV resin hardens with exposure to UV light, the bottle should always be closed with the lid twisted tight, and it should always be kept in a cool, dark area, like in a cabinet away from sunlight. Sometimes I like to transfer my UV resin into smaller black bottles with a needle tip applicator, just so that it's easier to work with for fine detail and precision. And I like to store these the same way as the larger bottle. On the back of UV resin bottles, it will show the different curing times to harden it. I found that every brand cures at different times depending on the weather, ambient temperature, UV light source, and the amount of liquid used. So I tend to use these numbers on the back just as a guide, and I found that it's better to cure longer just to make extra sure that everything has hardened. When I'm curing outside on a clear sunny day, I cure for at least 45 minutes. Since Australian sun rays are really strong, it cures pretty quickly. On cloudy days or during weaker winter light, it can usually mean a slow or incomplete cure, so I always find it's best to cure indoors using a UV lamp, but if you don't have one, I would try to cure outside for at least an hour depending on the temperature. On windy or rainy days and at nighttime, I always cure indoors for at least an hour under a UV lamp. To prepare my charms for glazing, I take my fully baked design and remove the eye pin by pulling it out of the clay. I then squeeze out a small amount of gel-type superglue onto the baking paper, and then just dip the straight end of the eye pin into it. And then put it back into the hole in the charm and let it set for a few minutes. Then, after putting on my gloves, the respirator safety mask, and other PPE, I take a small black needle tip applicator bottle that I filled with UV resin and squeeze some through the middle of the loop that sticks out. Then I cure that with my UV light until it's completely set. Then I take a paper clip and thread the eye pin through to the end. Then it's ready to glaze. First, I put on all of my safety gear and then unscrew the cap of the lid of the UV resin bottle. And pour a little bit into my cupcake liner. I find that you don't need much and a little goes a long way. I then take my brush and dip it into the UV resin, just getting a small amount over the bristles like this. I find that brushing on a small amount and building multiple layers over the top gives the best results, so I just paint a thin layer all over the surface of the clay. And allow it to level itself out, which just means to give it a minute and let it become smooth and flat, and UV resin will just do this on its own. I'll then shine my small UV light all over the uncured liquid, and this will just snap cure it so that it hardens and no dust can attach to the charm. Then I'll slide the top of the paperclip onto the chopstick, which I've just taped to the top of a canister lid. I then put another piece of tape over the top of the paperclip so that it stays put. And then I'll bring the whole thing outside in the sun until it's fully hardened. After it's cured, I repeat all the steps, so I'll paint another layer of UV resin on top, and then snap cure it, and cure properly again outside, and I always like to do at least 2 coats. If I'm making shop charms or bulk glazing lots of charms at once, or if they won't fit on the chopstick, I'll set them onto a wire rack instead. If I'm curing charms indoors, I use my larger UV lamp and place it vertically so that the light is facing up. I'll thread the paper clips onto the chopstick and then tape that over the opening so that the charms can hang down into the machine. Then, because it's not a good idea to look into ultraviolet light or have it touching your skin, I like to place the cardboard sheet that I covered with foil over the top until it's fully cured. Since some of my pieces don't have an eye pin for the paperclip to hold onto while glazing, I like to glaze them in stages. So for example, with this frog on a lily pad, I'll glaze the frog first, cure it, and then glaze and cure the lily pad after. To cure a piece with no eye pin, I'll either hold it in the sun or stick it onto a big wodge of blue tack that's used for sticking posters to walls. And then just place that on top of a flat surface and leave it to cure. I found that you don't need to cure all the layers of your UV resin in one session. Sometimes I cure the second layer days or even weeks after the first one. You just need to make sure that each layer has completely cured before putting it away for another day. One of the easiest ways that I use to tell if UV resin is cured is to squeeze a small droplet out onto my cupcake liner and then place the whole thing next to the glazed polymer clay while it's curing either under sunlight or under the UV lamp. Then after a while, I put my gloves on and touch the droplet to see if it's cured. It should be completely dry and not leave any wet marks behind. This ensures that you don't actually touch the liquid on your finished piece and get glove marks all over it or ruin the finish. The UV resin should be hardened, shiny, and have no stickiness or tackiness on the piece. To dome flat pieces so that it has a raised, rounded surface, I like to use a silicone pot holder as my work surface. I find that it helps just in case the resin drips slightly and doesn't create a little pool on the bottom. I just place my flat baked piece on top of it and then squeeze some UV resin on top and spread it around the surface using a toothpick. Then because I want it to remain flat, I can't move it or transport it around. So I always cure it indoors using my UV light. Then once that's cured and nice and strong, I take it outside and let it cure completely under the sun. To secure earring posts to the back of jewellery, you might think that adding a layer of UV resin would be a strong and durable way to do it, but that's actually not a good idea. Since cured UV resin can cause allergic reactions if it's in contact with skin for long periods of time, I actually don't recommend this method. I found the best way is to embed or sandwich the post in between the earring and another layer of clay instead. How I do that is add a dot of bacon bond onto the back of a fully baked and unglazed piece. Then I place the earring post on top and brush on some more bacon bond all over the back. and then roll out and cut a new piece of the same shape. And lay that over the top, just making sure to poke the post through it. And then fully baking everything once more. I then sand the edges to make everything smooth. And I like to do this with wet sandpaper, just so that I don't breathe in any of the dust. Then I find it's best to glaze only the front of the piece with UV resin and not the back or sides. You could leave the back of the earring as plain baked clay with nothing on it, or if you want a shiny effect, you could sand and buff the clay to a high shine, or you could also glaze it with a water-based polyurethane in a gloss finish instead. After curing, all resin, both UV and epoxy, will eventually take on a slight yellow colour. This does happen over time, but some brands happen quicker than others. You can see it on the left gingerbread house, and this was done with the Chow Chow brand. I left the one on the right unglazed so that you could see the difference. You can see that it's a little bit discoloured. I don't think that it's super noticeable, but it has changed over time. I find that it happens much faster if the cured resin is exposed to high heat or UV light, so a good way to prevent it or prolong it from happening for as long as possible is to keep the resin out of sunlight. I like to store my pieces inside my charm collection box in a dark drawer when not in use. You could also use alternatives to resin to add shine to your pieces that I mentioned earlier to avoid the yellowing altogether. If you have sticky UV resin, it usually means it hasn't cured or hardened fully. It may be from your UV lamp wattage not being strong enough, or you haven't cured it for enough time. You don't need to wipe the stickiness off with anything like isopropyl alcohol because you'll just be wiping off the uncured UV resin. Doing this can actually make your piece cloudy, so I would say to cure the piece instead for at least an hour just in case, because some brands take much longer to cure than the instruction guide on the back of the bottle. Sometimes you'll see that pouring or brushing on UV resin can create invisible bubbles on your piece, which need to be popped before curing. After brushing the resin on, the best way that I've found to remove bubbles is to let the piece sit for a few minutes so that the resin can self-level, and this just lets the bubbles rise to the surface. I then use a long type of gas lighter. And wave it over the surface quickly, and this will pop the bubbles. I then let it self-level again, and then cure it until it's completely hardened. Sometimes you might find that UV resin will start to pull away or repel from itself or the edges of your piece. You can usually see it before or after curing, and you end up with these little craters in the finish. I find that oily surfaces can cause this, which affects the self-leveling or smoothing out of the liquid. So to prevent it before applying UV resin, you can wipe down your baked piece with some isopropyl alcohol or nail polish remover to remove any oil off the surface. You could even sand your piece if it's completely flat. Since there are raised parts on my designs, I like to brush on a couple of thin layers of matte water-based polyurethane just to give the UV resin something to cling onto. So I just brush on a layer, let it air dry, and then just brush on some UV resin over the top and cure it as normal. I find it works really well and it doesn't affect the final finish of my charms and figurines. If you do have some spots that are missing after curing, you can just brush over some more UV resin and it will level itself out. Then just cure it again and it'll look nice and smooth. Once I finish working with my UV resin, I open the lid of the bottle and then use my paintbrush to pick up any leftover uncured resin off the silicone cupcake liner. Then I just put the excess back in the bottle for later use. I'll then just place the cupcake liner in the sun, and this will just cure any excess. And then I just peel it off when it's hardened. And I really like that the liner is made out of silicone because I can just reuse it again and again. If I have cured droplets, I'll remove those as well. I actually don't throw these away because I don't think it's good for the environment, so I keep them to use on other projects. To clean my brush, I swish it around in some nail polish remover, or you could also use some isopropyl alcohol. And then I just leave the brush to air dry. If I've accidentally spilt some UV resin, I just use an isopropyl alcohol wipe to clean down my work surface. And turn my gloves inside out. And then dispose of them and any cleaning materials that I've used. And that's all for this tutorial. If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any further questions about glazing polymer clay with UV resin, feel free to ask them in the comment section below and I'll do my best to answer them for you. Thank you so much for watching and I'll see you next time. Bye!